Please, why don't you come? Yeah. I was going to introduce it before you applauded for it, because some of you don't know who you're applauding. Dealing with the history of the British in Palestine, in the Middle East, inevitably intersected with the history of Zionism. But they are separable, though they intersect significantly. So we have planned the second segment of the morning, which is focused on historical information for our understanding of the current reality. We have focused on the history of Zionism. I think not just modern Zionism, but our speaker is going to say some about ancient Zionism as well. Is that right?
Well, what I'm doing is a broad overview.
Okay, good. Ayala Zonnenschein is our speaker. We're so grateful that she could be here today. She is an American Israeli. She grew up in the U.S., studied in Germany, and went to Israel for the first time at the age of 20. She lived in Israel for 14 years, in Jerusalem on a kibbutz in the south of Israel in the Negev Desert, in Tel Aviv, as well as on a kibbutz in the north of Israel in the Galilee, and has traveled extensively around the country. Ayala is the executive director of the Havuruh Shir Hadash Synagogue here in Ashland. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. So, I'm not a professor, and I'm not a historian. And what I'm going to do is give you an overview of Zionism. What I am is an American Israeli Zionist. I've lived here in Ashland for 14 years, and it's my pleasure to be here to speak with you today. So, can you see that screen? Okay. So, what exactly is Zionism? Zionism is the progressive liberation movement of the Jewish people to return to the land of Israel, to reestablish the Jewish nation. The word Zionism comes from the Hebrew word Zion, which is a hill in Jerusalem. For nearly 2,000 years, since the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 AD, the Jews have prayed for the reestablishment of a Jewish state. Now, many of you have heard that Zionism is a form of colonialism, or that Zionism has led to Israel becoming an apartheid state. I am here to tell you this morning that these ideas are completely wrong. In fact, I will demonstrate to you that the opposite is true. Zionism was part of a wave of an anti-colonial movement in the early 20th century, when literally dozens of nations in Africa and Asia were asserting their independence from the domination of France, Belgium, and England. Zionism was nothing more and nothing less than the Jewish aspiration to gain independence from the British, much in the same way that the Congo did from Belgium. Zionism had the support of intellectuals and progressives throughout the 20th century. It's actually an idealistic success story that has overcome seemingly unsurpassable obstacles to realizing an impossible dream. Jews and Arabs are equally indigenous to this land, and it's important to note that the Jews maintained a continuous presence for over 3,000 years, according to archaeological and historical evidence. Now, Zionism has become a very loaded word, and I think this young man, Mohammed Zoabi, can express it even better than I can. Now, this past summer, when 3 Israeli teenagers were kidnapped and later murdered by Palestinians, this young man, a Muslim Arab boy, got on YouTube demanding their return. And I want you to hear what he says.
I want to just let my audience know who you are. You're Mohammed Zoabi. You were born to a Muslim Israeli family from Nazareth, and currently you're studying in high school. And this past summer you posted that video in English, Hebrew, and Arabic, supporting Israel and demanding for the return of the kidnapped boys before the news that they were killed. He received death threats for this, and eventually he had to go into hiding to stay safe. Now he's back, trying to be a normal teenager, yet he continues to support Israel. So here you are. You obviously have become famous for what you did, which was to go against the grain. Even if there are Arab Israelis that think that support Israel, that enjoy their freedom here and recognize that it's a different freedom than they get in the other Arab countries or maybe anywhere in this world, they don't wear a Star of David around their neck, and they don't go on YouTube in English, Hebrew, and Arabic supporting Israel. Is Zionism a dirty word?
If you asked me that question a couple of years ago, I would probably be somehow, whoa, wait a minute. The word Zionism and the way Arabs are viewing Zionism, though I always felt that I'm proud about being Israeli, but I never identified myself as Zionist. I recently started to explore and discover a lot of beautiful things about Zionism, and Zionism simply is the national movement that supports the idea of a Jewish state in the land of Israel. That's it. There's nothing dirty about that. But if you would ask me that question a couple of years ago, and if you would ask a lot of Arabs, no matter if they're Israeli Arabs, proud Israeli Arabs, or other Arabs, or also if you would ask a lot of people around the world, they would probably look at you in a kind of negative way, or they would be like, whoa, now that's a heavy word, now that's a negative word. And that's really unfortunate. I mean, that's so sad.
I think it's not just Arabs, by the way. I think it's the whole world that's so critical about this word. And I think it's so interesting.
They went off on a tangent here. I should have cut off just a second earlier. So now I'm going to take just a few minutes to look at the historical context that led up to the creation of Zionism. There are some points of Jewish history to show you why Zionism was necessary to the survival of the Jewish people. The Jewish population was routinely persecuted, massacred, expelled, forcibly converted, excluded from public service positions, and threatened with physical, spiritual, and cultural annihilation. So in 586 BC, the Babylonians conquered the kingdom of Judah. The first temple was destroyed and the people were exiled to Babylon. In 539, we see that Persia conquers Babylon and invites the Jews back and lets them rebuild their temple. In 167, we see the Hellenization of Israel, which led up to, in 165, the Maccabean revolt. Now, this was the first uprising for religious freedom that's commemorated every year on Hanukkah. Then we have the Hasmoneans ruling. And then, between the years 66 and 73, when the Romans take over Jerusalem, again, the second temple is destroyed. Many Jews are sold into slavery and sent into exile. Now, at this time, the Romans renamed Judea, the area of Judah, they renamed it Palestina. It was in an attempt to minimize Jewish identification with the land of Israel. It was their effort to de-Judaize the land. Now, the Romans at this time also built a temple on the ruins of the Holy Jewish Temple. They built a temple to Zeus. Later on, the Christians built a church there, and then in 132, between 132 and 135, we have the Bar Kokhba rebellion against Rome, which ultimately failed. Many thousands of Jews were killed. Roman troops take over Jerusalem and expel the Jews from the city. Then in 622, we see the rise of Islam. Jews are permitted to return to Jerusalem under Muslim rule, and actually most of the world's Jews are living under Muslim rule. And then about 691, the Muslims built their mosque on the ruins of the Holy Jewish Temple, which is still there today, which is the Dome of the Rock. Now, in 1085, we see that Toledo shifts from Muslim to Christian control, followed by the First Crusaders. Overall, about 25,000 Jews were killed by the Crusades. In 1144, we have the first blood libel appearing. And the blood libel is the allegation that Jews murder Christians, mostly Christian children, to use their blood for ritual purposes, such as an ingredient in the baking of our Passover matzah. Blood libels led to massacres of Jews, and sometimes even to the decimation of entire Jewish communities. The blood libel is still alive and well, and you can see it on Egyptian television today in a popular drama series. In 1215, we see that Jews for the first time in Europe are forced to wear special hats or badges, which we'll see later in the Holocaust as well. Then the Jews are expelled from England, from France, forced conversions in Spain. The Spanish Inquisition was established, and the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. I want to say here that no matter where the Jews were, every year at the conclusion of our Passover Seder, we say next year in Jerusalem. Each day, 3 times a day in fact, our prayers are infused with a longing for Jerusalem, for Zion. So in 1516, we see the first Jewish ghetto in Italy, where Jews are confined to a specific walled area. 1648, massacres of Jews in Poland, where hundreds of villages were destroyed. In 1770, we see the beginning of the Haskalah movement, which is the Jewish Enlightenment movement. This is a movement that held that if only the Jews would become more modern and live like other people, anti-Semitism would fall by the wayside. Some ghettos were opened, some Jews were granted more rights, and there was a wider opportunity for occupations. This led to a process of social and cultural assimilation in European countries, but Jews remained torn between their personal lives and public lives, trying to fit into the country they were living in, denying their own identity in an effort to be accepted. Was this successful? No, we'll see that it was not. Now, in 1791, civil rights are granted to Jews in France, but at the same time, Jews in Russia are confined to living within the Pale of Settlement near Kiev. In 1881, there are many pogroms in Eastern Europe and the start of major Jewish immigration to the United States. My own grandmother lived within the Pale of Settlement near Kiev. When she was 4, she remembers being hidden with her mother and siblings under piles of wood shavings as they heard the Cossacks coming through their village calling for the Jews. Luckily, she survived and later went to America with her family. In 1882, we see the first large wave of immigration to Israel, mostly from Russia and Romania. Now, the modern Zionism appears. Herzl, the father of modern political Zionism, was a journalist and political activist. covering the Dreyfus trial. Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish officer in the French army, wrongly accused of treason. His court-martial, conviction, and eventual acquittal after spending 12 years in prison was a wake-up call for the Jews, who realized that they would never be fully accepted as equals. The Dreyfus trial was a catalyst for Herzl, who concluded there is no hope for Jewish life in Europe. Zionism saw Eretz Yisrael, Zion, the land of Israel, which is how Jews refer to their land every day in their prayers, as the only place in which the Jews could become a productive, normal, and unified community responsible for its own destiny. Now, these early Zionists, in their attempt to defeat British colonialism, purchased land legally, mostly at exorbitant prices from absentee landlords residing in Cairo, Damascus, and Beirut. They were idealists, mostly socialists, who joined their brethren who were already in Palestine. Pierre Loti, a French writer, wrote in 1895 when he visited the land, "I traveled through the sad Galilee in the spring and I found it silent. In the vicinity of Mount Gilboa, as everywhere in Palestine, cities and palaces have returned to the dust. This melancholy abandonment weighs on all of the Holy Land." So at this point in time, the region is clearly not thriving. Then in 1917, we see the Balfour Declaration, which you already learned about this morning. It was a British declaration of support for a Jewish national home in Palestine, specifically referred to the historical connections of the Jewish people with Palestine and of reconstituting their national home in that country. The term reconstituting shows recognition of the fact that Palestine had been their home. The mandate was formalized by 52 governments of the League of Nations in 1922. And already at that time, it was understood that there would be an establishment of two states, and we'll see that later in the Peel Commission. So the end of World War I saw the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. World War I treaties determined what countries would be created on land surrendered by the Ottomans. No country was displaced by Israel's reestablishment. There were no sovereign states in the Middle East until after World War I. Jews were not European colonialists. At the end of World War I and the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, it was the ending of the colonial holdings of Britain and France, just the opposite of what some would have you believe. The Jews did not show up on Arab land after World War II, but were idealists returning to their ancient homelands to establish a country for themselves. They were not invaders, but immigrants who acquired deeds to the land through documented purchases and joined with fellow natives that had lived in that land for centuries. They were not illegal, but legal, per UN agreements, League of Nations agreements, and British mandated agreements. Following World War I, similar to all of the countries here in that region. Now, despite being bequeathed an enormous amount of the British mandate, some Arabs begrudged the Jewish people self-determination on the tiny portion to be returned as a resurrected homeland. But not all Arabs were unsupported, as you heard earlier of Emir Faisal, who joined Dr. Weizmann, president of the Zionist organization. They together signed the Faisal-Weizmann Agreement for Arab-Jewish Cooperation. And this quote, I'm going to read to you, of Faisal. "We Arabs look with the deepest sympathy on the Zionist movement. We will do our best, insofar as we are concerned, to help them through. We will wish the Jews a most hearty welcome. I look forward, and my people with me look forward to a future in which we will help you, and you will help us, so that the countries in which we are mutually interested may once again take their place in the community of the civilized peoples of the world." Now, in response to violence in the land, the Peel Commission comes in 1937. It's a royal inquiry that came to Palestine from London to investigate the roots of the conflict and to propose solutions. The Commission issued its recommendations to abolish the mandate and partition the country between two peoples. You can see in this map, the pink part was what was to be Arab land. The orange part up top was to be given to the Jews. And the green part was going to remain part of the mandate. So while the Jews argued amongst themselves, some were for it, some were against it, the Arabs flatly rejected this proposal, and it was shelved. So in the 1930s, we see the rise of the Nazi regime. The Holocaust was a genocide in which approximately 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis and their collaborators, primarily during the years of 1941 through 1945. An additional 5 million non-Jewish victims of Nazis included homosexuals, gypsies, and many others, that brought the total of victims to about 11 million people. How did the world respond to that? Legal immigration to safety in Palestine, an area that had been assigned by the League of Nations as a Jewish homeland for Jews who were not safe in their original countries, was severely limited by the British in 1939, and many nations simply refused to allow European Jews entry to their countries. There are lots of stories that you can read online about that. Now we see the birth of the State of Israel, when doctors, teachers, and other professionals who arrived in Israel to transform the land by becoming farmers and restoring habitats, largely as a part of the kibbutz movement. This was a socialist vision of Israelis living and working together, pursuing the Zionist dream. The United Nations voted to divide the land so that a Jewish national homeland could be created. Now, much of the area allocated to the Jews was actually desert land. Most of that green area in the bottom part of that map is desert. But the Jews accepted. The partition was immediately rejected by the Arabs, and 5 Arab armies attacked Israel. Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq invaded the tiny new country with the declared intent of destroying it. Now, when Israel was created, there were many Jews living in the surrounding Arab lands, and they had for many years. But over the next 20-odd years, we see that they are expelled from the Arab lands. So now I want you to look at a comparison of Jewish refugees to Arab refugees. Whoops. Okay. This is not working. Okay. So there were approximately 870,000 Jews living in the Arab world when Israel was created, and about 830,000 Arabs living in what is now Israel. Approximately 700,000 Jews from these communities were forced to seek refuge in Israel or elsewhere in the West. About 700,000 Arabs sought refuge in the Arab world, mostly encouraged by the Arab states surrounding Israel, who told them that the Jews would murder them. Israel gave the Jews citizenship and full rights. The Arab countries denied citizenship and employment, except in Jordan, where they were forced to live in refugee camps. The result is that there are no Jewish refugees today, but there are 4.2 million Arab refugees, comprised of the children and the grandchildren of the 1948 refugees, who are still counted as refugees by the UN today. Now, it's really important to note here that in 1948, almost all of the 160,000 Palestinian Arabs who remained within Israel's borders became citizens. Today, Israeli Arab citizens have equal civil and human rights as all other Israeli citizens. George Deek, who is an Arab Israeli Christian whose family lived in Yaffo, just outside of Tel Aviv, for over 400 years. In 1948, the Nakba happened. This is the Arab term for the creation of the Jewish state, which means catastrophe. The Arab League convinced the Arabs to leave, assuring them that in a few days' time, the 5 Arab armies would attack Israel, destroy the country, and then they could all return home. Most of them fled by choice. Some were forced. Now, the Deek family fled north towards Lebanon, along with many others, and his family was actually scattered around the globe between various Arab countries in the United States and Australia. It was a humanitarian disaster of the Palestinians in 1948. However, this conflict was not the only one during the 19th and 20th centuries that led to expulsion and transfer. There were many. But just consider that at about the same time, Pakistan and India were partitioned, which resulted in 14 million people being transferred, the largest mass migration in human history. Do any of these people have a chance of returning to their homes? No. So how come the displacement of the Jews from the Arab world was completely forgotten, while the tragedy of the Palestinians is still alive in today's politics? In George's words, he says, because the Nakba has been transformed from a humanitarian disaster to a political offensive. It's no longer about remembering what happened, but about resenting the mere existence of Israel. And here I'll let him speak.
In the Arab world, the Palestinian refugees, including their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren, are still not settled, aggressively discriminated against, and in most cases denied citizenship and basic human rights. Why is it that my relatives in Canada are Canadian citizens, while my relatives in Syria, Lebanon, or the Gulf countries, who've been born there and know no other home, are still considered refugees? Clearly, the treatment of the Palestinians in the Arab countries is the greatest oppression they experience anywhere. And the collaborators in this crime are no other than the international community and the United Nations. Rather than doing its job and help the refugees build a life, the international community is feeding the narrative of victimhood. While there is one UN agency in charge of all the refugees in the world, the UNHCR, another agency was established to deal only with the Palestinian ones, UNRWA, UNRWA. This is no coincidence. While the goal of the UNHCR is to help refugees establish a new home, establish a future, and end their status as refugees, the goal of UNRWA is exactly opposite: to preserve their status as refugees and prevent them from being able to start new lives. The international community cannot seriously expect the refugee problem to be solved when it is collaborating with the Arab world in treating the refugees as political pawns, denying them the basic rights they deserve. Wherever the Palestinian refugees were granted equal rights, they prospered and contributed to their society, in South America, in the US, and even in Israel. In fact, Israel was one of the few countries that automatically gave full citizenship and equality for all the Palestinians in it after 48. And we see the results. Despite all the challenges, the Arab citizens of Israel built a future. Israeli Arabs are the most educated Arabs in the world, with the best living standards and opportunities in the region. Arabs serve as judges in the Supreme Court. Some of the best doctors in Israel are Arabs, working in almost every hospital in the country. There are 13 members of parliament, Arab members of parliament, who enjoy the right to criticize the government, a right that they exhaust to the fullest, protected by the freedom of speech. Arabs win popular reality shows, and you can even find Arab diplomats, and one of them is standing in front of you. Today when I walk in the streets of Jaffa, I see the old buildings and the old fort, but I also see children going to school and university. I see flourishing businesses, and I see a vibrant culture. In short, despite the fact that we still have a long road ahead of us as a minority, we have a future in Israel. I still didn't tell you the rest of my family story in 1948. So after a long journey towards Lebanon, most of it by foot, my grandparents, George and Vera, reached Lebanon. So they stayed there for many months. And while there, my grandmother gave birth to her first son, my uncle Sammy. And when the war was over, they realized that they have been lied to. One, the Arabs did not win the war as promised, but also at the same time, the Jews did not kill all the Arabs as they were told that would happen. And my grandfather looked around him and saw nothing but a dead-end life as a refugee. He looked at his young wife Vera, not even 18 yet, and his newborn son, and knew that in a place stuck in the past, with no ability to look forward, there is no future for his family. While his brothers and sisters saw their future in Lebanon or other Arab countries or in the Western world, he thought otherwise. He wanted to go back to Jaffa, his hometown. Because he worked with Jews in the past and was a friend to some of them, he was not brainwashed with hate. My grandfather George did what very few others would have dared. He reached out to those that his community saw as their enemies. And he got hold of one of his friends from the electricity company and asked him for his help to get back. And that friend, of whom I've only heard through my father's story and never really knew his name, was not only able and willing to help my grandfather get back, but in an extraordinary act of grace, he even helped him get his old job back at what has become the Israeli Electricity Company, making him one of the very few Arabs who work there. And today, among my siblings and cousins, we have accountants, teachers, insurance agents, high-tech engineers, diplomats, factory managers, university professors, doctors, lawyers, investment consultants, managers of companies, architects, and even electricians. And the reason that my family have succeeded in life, and the reason that I'm standing in front of you today as an Israeli diplomat and not as a Palestinian refugee from Lebanon, is because my grandfather had the courage to take a decision that was unthinkable to others. Rather than falling into despair, he found hope where no one else dared looking for it. He chose to live among those who were considered his enemies and to make them his friends. And for that, I and my family owe him and my grandmother eternal gratitude. The story of the Deek family should serve as a source of inspiration to the Palestinian people. We cannot change the past, but we can secure a future for our next generations, and if we want to mend the past someday. We can help Palestinian refugees have a normal life. We can be sincere about our past and learn from our mistakes. And we can unite Muslims, Jews, and Christians to protect our right to be different, and by that, preserve our humanity. Indeed, we can change the past, but if we do all that, we will change the future. Thank you.
So if you're interested, you can see the full video of his talk. It's on YouTube. He talks a lot about not looking back, looking forward, and he compares his people to the survivors of the Holocaust, who did just that, who looked forward and created new lives wherever they ended up being. So now let's look at the demographics of Zionism, a pluralistic society. So Israel is the only Middle Eastern country where the Christian population is thriving instead of disappearing. Israel's non-Jewish majority forms about 20% of the population and is made up of Arab Muslims, Arab Christians, non-Arab Christians, Druze, Bedouins, Circassians, Asians, and others. 80